So today's Ento Live is all about bumblebees. I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Penelope Whitehorn, who will be talking about a really significant paper that came out in 2022 about bumblebees and their differing habitats. And it's all about how a decade of citizen science has really increased our knowledge of that and going to help inform future conservation and monitoring of bumblebees. I see it being a very popular paper, and when I saw it, I was really keen to get one of the authors to come and talk about it. So over to you, Penelope, to talk about your work.
Great, thanks, Kieran, and hi everybody. Thank you very much for coming to listen to this talk on such a beautiful sunny day. It's great to be here on Ento Live. So I'm going to talk today about some of my past research that has been on bumblebees and their different habitat and climatic preferences. And this research was carried out with colleagues at my previous research institute, which I'll mention later, and also Richard Comont at the Bumblebee Conservation Trust, who I'm sure some of you have heard of. But before I get into bees, I'm just going to briefly introduce myself. So my research on bees all started, hold on, trying to change to the next slide, 1 second. There we go. Yeah, my research on bumblebees all started at the University of Stirling, where I did my PhD and also some postdoc fellowship work. And I studied bumblebees in the field and also in the lab, looking at various things like inbreeding and the effects of parasites and pesticides. And then later I moved with my family to Garmisch-Partenkirchen in southern Germany, where I was fortunate to receive an Alexander von Humboldt research fellowship. And I studied at the Karlsruhe Institute of Technology's Alpine campus. And it was when I was working here that I carried out the research that I'm going to be talking about today, which is actually on bumblebees in the UK, which is slightly confusing. But it was wonderful to live in this beautiful alpine area. And of course, I did see some wonderful alpine bumblebees. Like on the left there is a bee called the Eisenhuthummel, and that's specializes just on that one flower, the wolfsbane. It only feeds from that flower. So it's really very rare as a result. And at the top right there is the alpine bumblebee, which is a true mountain specialist. And the bottom right is the forest mountain bumblebee, which is a specialist nectar robber because it has these really massive jaws. So it was really inspiring to live in such a habitat surrounded by all these wonderful bumblebees and the beautiful flowery meadows. But back to the UK, which is where I work now as co-chief scientist for Highlands Rewilding, which is a company which focuses on nature restoration in Scotland. But I do bring in bumblebees still when and where I can into this work. So now I'll just briefly introduce bees in the UK. And we have a small poll here, which will just be quite interesting to sort of gauge the knowledge in the room, really. So I think Kieran's going to put that up for everybody to see. And the question is, just how many species do you think of bees that we have in the UK? So do we have about 20 to 25 different species, or 40 to 50, or 100 to 120? Oh, and there's the fourth option actually is missing there. It should be more than 250 bee species. So I don't know if it's too late to change that now, possibly.
Yeah, I don't think we can change it. So.
Oh well, never mind.
I'll tell you what, hang on. It'll only take a second. Edit this. Yeah, maybe it is more difficult. There we go. Sorry about that, Penelope. So
that's okay.
The last option should be
more than
200.
More than 250 species was the last option. Yeah.
All right, let's try that again. So you've all got another go now. We'll keep you busy. So yeah, as Penelope said, how many bee species do we have in the UK? 20 to 25, 40 to 50, 100 to 120, and more to 50. And just to clarify, Penelope, are you asking just about bumblebees or about all bees?
I'm talking about all bees at the moment. Yeah.
All bees. So yeah. Okay. I think most people have answered. If you haven't got your answer in,
Yeah.
get it in. I'm going to end the poll and I'll leave you to discuss it, Penelope.
Yeah, so that's interesting. So you can see from that most people have picked that fourth option, which was the missing one to start with, because that's quite correct. There are more than 250 different species of bees in the UK, which comes as a surprise to many people. In fact, we have more than 270 species, and this includes all the fascinating different solitary bees that we have as well. And only one of these many species is the honeybee, which also comes as a surprise to some, because that's the most familiar to bee to many people. But my research has always focused on bumblebees. And in the UK, we have 24 different species at the moment. 2 species have already gone extinct, so we're left with 24. And I might be a bit biased, but bumblebees are brilliant for many reasons, not least because they are really fantastic pollinators. And this beautiful photograph here by my old colleague, Mario Vallejo Marin at the University of Stirling, got this wonderful photo of a bumblebee in action, buzz pollinating this flower. And this is a very special type of pollination. And where the bee is gripping very tightly onto the anther with her jaws, you can see her doing that there, and she's buzzing, but without flapping her wings. And it's this buzz at just the right frequency that is shaking the anther like a pepper pot, which releases the pollen, and you can actually see a few grains of pollen coming out at the end there. And there are quite a few crops that actually really need this type of pollination. There's tomatoes, potatoes, and then other species like blueberries and melon and cucumber. They all need to be buzz pollinated. And there are some solitary bees that can do this as well, but honeybees can't. And bumblebees probably are the best at it because of their big size. So yeah, they're really fantastic pollinators of many crops and also, of course, many wild flower species. So they're really important parts of our ecosystem and also just very beautiful, as you can see from this picture. And their life cycle also is worth a mention. I'll just talk you through that now, for those of you not familiar with it. So it's only the queen bumblebee that survives over winter in hibernation. And she emerges in early spring. So those really big bumblebees that you see in early spring, often flying quite sort of slowly and heavily, are the big queens newly out of hibernation. And they will gather pollen and nectar and set up their own nest. And they usually do this by building a big pot, which they fill with nectar, and they make a little pollen ball and they lay their eggs into that. And from these eggs will come the first worker bees. So these are all her daughters. They're all sisters to each other. And they take over the foraging duties. So they go out from the nest and collect pollen and nectar. And then the queen then will just stay inside the nest and just carry on laying eggs. And she'll change from producing workers to producing new queens and males towards the end of the summer. And these will emerge out of the nest and leave and look for each other and mate. And then everybody dies except that newly mated queen. So the males don't live very long, they die off, and all the old workers and that old queen all die. And it's just that newly mated queen that goes into hibernation and survives to emerge the following spring. So they have an interesting life cycle, and yeah, really important insects to us. But unfortunately, as I'm sure many of you know, they haven't been doing so well of late. Many species have been suffering from really big population declines. And this can be really well illustrated by 2 species in particular. So firstly, there's this bee, the shrill carder bee, Bombus sylvarum. And this map here shows its distribution before 1980. So you can see it was never a very common bee, but it was quite well distributed throughout England and Wales. But after the year 2000, it had retreated right down to these few isolated populations, and it's become very rare indeed and is quite threatened with extinction. And then another species is this lovely bumblebee, Bombus distinguendus, which is the great yellow bumblebee. And this is its distribution before 1980, so quite a good distribution throughout the UK and Ireland. But after 2000, it had retreated right up to the north and west coasts, and it's just found in these quite few sort of areas just along those coastal maca grasslands, and it's become very rare and threatened. And these declines are reflected across many other species of bumblebees, and of course many other insects and invertebrates as a whole. And these declines are happening for a number of reasons, but probably most importantly as land use change, particularly towards more intensive agriculture. And so unfortunately, a lot of our land is becoming to look more like this. So you can see that that is basically a desert for bees. And of course, there is climate change as well, which is not helping, particularly as bees are species that, bumblebees are adapted to more colder climates. They're more of a temperate species. So climate change is definitely a problem for them, and it's only going to get worse. And scientists have predicted that these ongoing changes are going to cause many more population declines and probably quite a few species extinctions as well. So there's a real need to protect our bumblebees, not least to safeguard our future pollination services. And this is where more knowledge is really useful, because if we understand more about how different species relate to different types of land use and different climatic variables, then we can really understand what might happen as these change in the future. And so we can target conservation sort of more effectively. And there has been quite some sort of large-scale computer modelling by scientists already looking into this, but these sort of models really only use very broad land use classes. So just divide all land into classes like arable or pasture. And as I'm sure you're aware, bumblebees need a lot more sort of detail than that in their lives. They rely a lot more on sort of the different habitat niches within all these different land use classes. And so we could really do with all this information on a very large scale. So lots of detail, but over a large scale, not just from the particular area where a scientist happens to be working. But how could we get all this data that we need? Well, luckily, we have a lot of it already, and more is being collected every day. And this is by people like you and me collecting this data, the citizen scientists. And we're really lucky in the UK that we have a number of programs running which people can sign up to and get involved in these projects and collect data that's really important. And the research I'm talking about today is all based around one of the larger citizen science projects in the UK. It's the Beewalk survey scheme run by the wonderful Bumblebee Conservation Trust. And this is where somebody will sign up to be a bee walker, and they will walk a monthly survey from March until October when bumblebees are on the wing, along a transect that they've sort of identified and mapped. And they will record all the bumblebees and the different species that they see and the numbers of them. And the aims of this survey scheme are fourfold. So firstly, it's to collect long-term data on bumblebees and their distributions and the numbers of them. And then so this data can be analysed to identify the different population trends, so are the numbers going up or down, and what might be causing these changes. And then these findings will be used to inform policy and also conservation interventions because of our improved understanding of what bumblebees are feeding on and what different management changes are actually having, what their impact is on bumblebee numbers. And last but not least, these sort of schemes encourage a better public understanding of bumblebees, which is really important because when people understand something, they love it all the more and want to protect it as well. And these next graphics just come from the Beewalk sort of latest report written by Richard Comont and his colleague at the Bumblebee Conservation Trust. And it just shows how the scheme has grown over time. So it started up in 2008 at the University of Stirling, actually, when I was doing my PhD there. And the first couple of years were just trial runs. So there was only 12 bee walkers walking a handful of transects, and they sent in just over 500 records of bumblebees that they had seen. But by 2021, there was 644 bee walkers working in the UK, voluntarily, obviously. And between them, they walked 775 transects and sent in more than 36,000 records of bumblebees. So that shows you that it's a massive resource. There's so much data there. It's a really fantastic thing to be able to use and work with. And so in our study, we used 10 years of Beewalk data. So we took the data from 2010 to 2019, and we analysed this alongside national scale land cover data and also climate data. And we also added into the analysis the detailed habitat data that the bee walkers themselves had recorded as they walked along the transects. And the aim of this work was to investigate how these different land uses and habitats and the climatic variables affects the abundance of 14 different bumblebee species in the UK. And this picture here shows the lovely ladies that we looked at. And this research was published towards the end of 2021 in this research paper here in the Journal of Applied Ecology. And it is open access. So if you're interested in more detail than I'm going to give today, then yeah, do look it up online and you can download a copy, and it's all in there. But I'm going to talk through the sort of main methods and results now, so hopefully give you an idea of what it was all about and what we found. But if you remember at the beginning, I did say that there were 24 species of bumblebees in the UK, but we only looked at 14 different species. So what happened to those other 10? Why didn't we include those ones in our analysis? Well, there was a number of reasons. The first one was, unfortunately, a couple of species were just too rare to include. And this included the lovely great yellow bumblebee. That was just seen on too few occasions in that 10-year period to analyze in any sort of meaningful way. And the second reason was actually that some of our bumblebees are brood parasites. They're a very different sort of bumblebee. We have 6 of these species in the UK, and they're called cuckoo bumblebees because they actually live very similar to the birds' cuckoos. The queens of these species will invade another species' nest, and they have their preferred species to parasitize, and they look quite similar to that species. And they'll invade the nest and lay their own eggs, and the workers of that original nest will look after the young and raise them. And this will only produce new queens and males of that cuckoo bumblebee. So they have no worker caste. And because they live in this very different way, we didn't include them in the analysis because they have no worker bumblebees. So that would be another study entirely. And the third reason is that some of our bumblebees are actually too well disguised. They're called the cryptic bumblebees. And I can actually explain this a bit better with the next slide, where I start to talk through the species that we did include. So if you look at these 2 pictures here, on the top there's the very familiar buff-tailed bumblebee. And at the bottom is the white-tailed bumblebee, which is Bombus lucorum. And it's this species that actually contains 2 other hidden species. So it's not just Bombus lucorum, it's also Bombus magnus and Bombus cryptarum. And they all look basically exactly the same, and it's impossible to distinguish them in the field. And the only really way that you can tell them apart is by doing sort of analysis in the lab, sort of molecular analysis to actually look at their DNA. But once you have looked at their DNA and you know who is who, you can begin to see that there are some differences between them. They have very slight differences in habitat preferences. But again, that's another story. So for the purpose of this talk, we included all these 3 cryptic species together. And also you can see from these 2 pictures here that you can tell the queens and males of these 2 apart. They look quite different, but the workers are very similar. And again, you can't tell them apart reliably in the field. So again, we included them together in the analysis. So it was 4 species in 1 in that case. And I'll just talk through briefly now the other species that we did include as well, just so you're familiar with all the different ones we were looking at, because they come up again in the results. So again, more yellow and black and whites, and at first glance, they look the same, but when you look more closely, you can see they have quite different markings. So the top there is the garden bumblebee, which is a lovely big bee with a long face. And at the bottom, the heath bumblebee, which has similar markings, but it's actually much smaller as well, and it has a round face, so it's easy to tell apart in the field. And then these ones are much rarer white-tailed bumblebees. At the top, there's the ruderal bumblebee, only really found in England. And at the bottom, the broken belted bumblebee. And this one actually does look quite similar to the white-tailed, and it is a bit confusing to identify. So that one perhaps might not be quite as rare as we think it is. It's just been missed quite a few times in the field, possibly. And this one is very distinctive. And if you're listening in from England, you might well be familiar with this one. It's very common and very distinctive markings. And it's an interesting bee because this is actually quite a recent arrival in the UK. We never used to have this species here. But it's moved up with climate change and it's expanding further north. And it's been racing up the country these past few years. And again, we've been able to pick up this really well with the data from the Beewalk scheme. And it wouldn't be surprising if this one soon also gets into sort of further north in Scotland. Right, and onto the red-tailed bumblebees. The top one is the more common red-tailed bumblebee, not very originally named. And at the bottom is the early bumblebee, which is a pretty small little species, and as its name suggests, comes out a bit earlier in the season compared to others. And then we have these slightly rarer ones, the red-shanked with the red hairs on its legs. And the bottom one is bottom right is my personal favourite, very pretty bee, the bilberry or blaeberry bumblebee, which is more of an upland specialist. So you'll find it in the pine forests in Scotland and in moorland areas. And then finally, onto the brownie coloured bees. So these are the carder bees. At first glance, they look pretty similar, but you can actually identify these ones in the field. The top left is the common carder bee, Pascorum, and it's very common, as you can see from its distribution map. And bottom left, the brown banded carder, much rarer. And the moss carder bee is more of a coastal species. Okay, so those were the bumblebees. And where were the transects that we analysed? So we only included transects in this 10-year period that were walked 3 or more times in a year. And this was to try and minimise false negatives. Because if a person walks their transect more than 3 times in a year, if a bee is present in that area, they're likely to see it on at least one of those occasions. So this meant that, quite a bit of the data was discluded from the analysis, but hopefully fewer false negatives. So in total, we had more than 2,300 annual transect counts, and these all came from a total of 1,001 unique grid reference locations. And it's those that are shown on the map on the right there. So you can see we had a pretty good coverage across the UK. There are some empty patches, like in the borders and also up in the northwest of Scotland, but on the whole, a pretty good coverage. So we should be able to get from this quite a good understanding of what is going on across the country as a whole. And now, yes, this is the number of bumblebees counted, the number of records included in the analysis. And that looks like a pretty boring table at first glance, but I'll just talk through it, and it's got some really interesting detail in it. So the top line is the white-tailed bumblebee group. So that includes those 4 species that are hard to tell apart in the field. And so in total, over the 10 years on those transects, there were just over 150,000 records of these bees. And so that's a large number. That's not that surprising, as it is 4 species in one. The next most common was the common carder bee, with just over 90,000 records. So very common bee indeed. And then there is the red-tailed bumblebee, 63,000. And then there's quite a big drop in numbers. So the next comes the early bumblebee, the tree and the garden bumblebee with 13,000 to 20,000 records. And so those top 6 species, plus the extra ones hidden in there, you can see those really are the common species that we have in the UK. So if you're out and about walking in your garden, it's most likely that it's one of these species that you're seeing. Because then you can see from the numbers below, there is suddenly a big drop, and the other species really are much rarer. So you can see that there comes down that the carder bees, Humilis and Muscorum, and then again a bit of a drop down to the heath bumblebee and the shrill carder, and on down to even more rare at the bottom. And so these ones were sort of very rarely seen over that 10-year period. So I think that shows the quite interesting split in the species that we have. Next slide. And now I'll just talk through the land use and the habitat variables that we included. So the land use classes were the very broad divisions. So we divided the whole of the UK up into these 7 classes. So either pasture and peri-urban, and that means urban, but including some green spaces. So the areas that have sort of parks and gardens in as well. And arable land, forest, water wetland, semi-natural, and finally urban. We also did have coniferous forest as a class in here, but that was such a tiny proportion of land in the areas around our transects that we actually discounted it later. And then the 15 habitat classes are the ones collected by the bee walkers themselves, noting down what was observed on the transects that they walked. And you can see these are much more detailed, so it includes things like freshwater edge, and the different types of grassland. Was it semi-unimproved or was it improved? And things like scrub and bracken and set aside and gardens. So it's bringing in a lot more detail there. And the next slide just shows the climate variables, and you don't need to worry at all about the details here, but this just shows that we had 7 different climate variables, all based around temperature and rainfall. And finally, we also included elevation. So that was everything that we included into the analysis. So what did we find? How were all these things affecting the bumblebees and their numbers? I'm now going to talk you through some of the graphs, and they're a little bit complicated at first glance. So I'll just explain what you're seeing first. So this is what one of the sort of graphs looks like. It's basically a pizza, and each slice of the pizza is a variable. So it could be either a land use one or a climate one. So something like arable or amount of rainfall in a year. And if that pizza slice is blue, it means that that variable had a negative effect on the numbers of that bumblebee species. So if it was a blue pizza slice on the arable land use class, it shows that there were fewer bumblebees of that species around arable land. But if it's red, it means there was a positive effect. So for example, if the temperature pizza slice had a positive effect, it shows more bumblebees when there was more warmer temperatures. And the concentric rings are just different distances from the center of the transect. So the inner ring is 500 meters from the center of the transect. The next ring is 1 kilometer, and then it goes out to 2 kilometers from the center of the transect, just to have a look at how things are changing at different scales. So if we have a look at the first species, so this is the white-tailed species group, so that 4 species in one. And you don't need to worry about the detail or the numbers at all, but we can just pick out a few interesting things from each one that we look at. So if the left-hand side shows the land use and the right hand is the climate. And I'm going to focus on talking about the land use just during this presentation. But if you want any more details, then of course, just have a look at the paper, and there should be a lot more information in there. So if we look at the left-hand segment, you can see straight away that water wetland is a very red pizza slice. So that's showing that this type of land use has a real positive association with the worker bees of this species. And interestingly, arable land at a larger scale has a negative influence. Okay, and so we'll move on now to some other species. This is the other 4 more common species. And again, don't worry about all the details. There's a lot in this picture, but if we just pick out a few things. So if we look at top left first, so that's the common carder bee, that are the very common bumblebee, you can see again that water wetland is coming out as very positive. So that sort of land use has a positive effect on the numbers. But interestingly, the pizza slice next door is a semi-natural land that actually had a negative effect on the numbers of these species present. And then if you look at top right, that's the red-tailed bumblebee. That one looks quite strange at first glance because that's all red. It's basically completely red. And that just indicates that this species is very much more of a generalist when looking at land use types. It's not particularly influenced by any, especially looking at the broad classes this is. And bottom right is that tree bumblebee, the recent arrival in the UK. And again, that's quite a generalist species, as you would expect, as it's doing so well. But you can see the darker red colours show a stronger effect. There's a darker red for forest and also peri-urban and pasture to a certain extent, which is interesting. And that shows because it is called the tree bumblebee for a reason, and that's because it nests in trees. And also things like bird nest boxes and gardens, but always quite high up above the ground. So that shows that's picking out that detail in this analysis. It does need those forests in the landscape. Okay, and I think that's all we'll take from that one. We'll move on to the next group of species. So these ones were the less common species, not the really rare ones, but the ones sort of, but still quite rare. So top left is the garden bumblebee. And you can see this one was actually the blue pizza slices, the main ones are for urban and peri-urban. So even though it's called the garden bumblebee, it's really not associating at all with our urban areas. And this could be to do with the fact that because it has a very long face, if you remember, I mentioned earlier, and this is because it has a really long tongue, and it's specially adapted for feeding from the flowers which has the nectar stored quite deep, which often are all the more sort of wildflower types, cottage garden type of flowers, which of course we've lost so many from our more urban areas. But you can see most of these species, apart from Genus on the bottom right, all the other three have semi-natural land as coming out as a strong positive influence at a larger scale, which is interesting to note. Okay, and we're going to move on now to a different sort of graph. So I'm really sorry for the people who dislike graphs, but I'm going to talk through it and hopefully it won't be too complicated once I've talked through it, because this is quite interesting. It's looking at the more detailed habitat types. So this first one is the species group. So those 4 species in one, the whitetails. And the vertical lines are the bees, and the black lines are the worker bees, and the brown lines are the buff-tailed queens and males, because if you remember, I said you can tell the queens and males apart in this group, just not the workers. So the brown lines are the buff-tailed queens and males, and the blue lines are the white-tailed queens and males. And there is a horizontal line at 0 going across the graph. And if the coloured lines are above this line, that shows that that habitat variable had a positive effect on that bee species. But if the coloured lines are below, it had a negative effect. So we'll just pick out a couple of them. You can see, if you can see 5th along from the right of the habitat types, you have freshwater edge. And you can see this one had a positive impact on workers and queens and males of all of that. So they really positively associate with this sort of habitat type. But for others, there was some difference between the buff-tailed and the white-tailed reproductives, which was interesting. So for example, so the blue lines, the reproductives of the whitetails, they had positive associations with scrub, bracken and herbs and also woodland. But the buff-tailed queens and males were found more where there were hedges and lanes. So that shows some interesting differences there. And we'll go on to look at a few more species, but again, don't worry about the details. We'll just pick out a couple of things. So here, the top is the common carder bee, the very common pascorum, and the bottom, the red-tailed bee. You can see here that the freshwater edge, again, is coming out as a really positive for the common carder bee, and also hedges and lanes are important for the workers of both these species. But woodland, interestingly, is having a negative effect on the workers of both species. And just finally, a few more, and again, don't worry too much about picking out all the differences here. But just to mention a few things, freshwater edge is again coming out as really important. Improved grassland, so that's the sort of grassland that doesn't have many wild flowers. That's having negative effects on the queens and males of a couple of these species. And yet again, some differences between what the sort of preferences between the reproductives and the workers there. And I'm just going to show one more slide with graphs, so please bear with me. If you can just hang on for one more, and I'll talk through some more results, because if you remember, I haven't actually mentioned any of those much rarer species yet. So we've got one graph just talking through some of the results of these rarer species. So these are the ones that are really not often observed. And again, this graph is the same sort of type. So if the coloured lines are above that central horizontal line at 0, it means that that land use type is having a positive impact. So now we're back to the broader land use types. And the left-hand one is Bombus sylvarum, the shrill carder bee, that one that has suffered from massive declines. And you can see all the coloured lines there are above where there is water wetland. So that shows that this sort of habitat is really important for this bee. And indeed, the areas where this species is still found is quite a lot of wetland reserves and things. And interestingly, the next species along, Bombus ruderatus, the ruderal bumblebee, that has quite very positive associations with arable land. And there have been some agri-environment schemes specifically targeted for this bumblebee by planting some wildflower strips and things like that in agricultural fields. So potentially this is why this one is still able, it's quite happy in a habitat like that. And then if we just look, the ones on the right, Monticular, my favorite, the bilberry bumblebee, and bottom right is that broken belted one. They both have negative associations with peri-urban land, so they're not really close to urban areas, but very positive associations with semi-natural land. So they're obviously reliant on those larger tracts of semi-natural land. Okay, so you can all breathe a sigh of relief. That's come to the end of the graphs now, but hopefully you picked up some sort of interesting bits of information from there. And of course, if you want any more detail, then do have a look at the paper. But I'll just talk through some of the key messages now. So what are the main things that we found out with all this analysis? So firstly, was the fact that there were so many differences among the bumblebee species and the types of habitat and land use that they are associated with. And this does suggest that a one-size-fits-all approach to bumblebee conservation won't effectively protect all species. And that's quite interesting because bumblebees are generalist foragers, so they are happy to feed on all sorts of different types of flowers. So you would have thought that they would be fine. If there's flowers, they'll be fine. But you can see that there's a lot more detail that's needed and consideration of the different sort of niches that they fit into. And so conservation efforts should be carefully tailored to each individual species. And our results do seem to suggest that the rarer species do require larger areas of continuous semi-natural vegetation. So the semi-natural land use class is those larger tracts of semi-natural land in the UK, the more upland areas. It doesn't account for those tiny pockets of wildness that we have in our farm fields and in our gardens. And the fact that the rarer species are associating with the larger scale semi-natural land does suggest that they need this more continuous sort of wild land. And that does show the importance of corridors connecting these lands, enabling these species to travel between these wilder areas. But water wetland, broad land use class, as well as the habitat niches, freshwater edges, as well as bogs and marsh and mire, did have positive associations with quite a range of the different species. And this real positiveness of watery landscapes and habitats is probably arising from a number of different reasons. Firstly, it's because the wetlands are often the primary undeveloped land in lowland areas. So they simply act as a proxy for the availability of flower-rich areas and vegetation, and also a lower intensity of use because there won't be that high use of pesticides in wetland areas. And also in arable areas, the remaining patches of good habitat are often those buffer strips along rivers and stream edges. And so bumblebees are associating with these simply because they remain more often than any other natural areas in our really human-dominated landscapes. But as well as this, these wetter areas have an intrinsic value of their own as habitats for the flowers that they provide. And also they're going to be less affected by droughts, which in itself reduces flower availability. And this is going to become more of an issue as the climate changes. And other interesting things we found out that these habitat associations seem to differ between the workers and the reproductives, the queens and males. For example, those white-tailed reproductives were associating with the forest land cover type and the woodland habitat. And this shows that these sort of tree-covered areas may be important for the reproductive success of these species, perhaps through the provision of suitable nest sites. And on the other hand, scrub and bracken and herbs were showing as important for the reproductives of other species. And hedges and lanes came out really well for many species for the workers. So this does suggest that they provide important forage, probably at that time of year when the workers are mainly on the wing, collecting nectar and pollen for their nests. So yeah, that brings me to the end of all the things that we found out from this research. So it was really fascinating. It was such a massive analysis. It actually took a number of years to get through it all. And we picked out, there was just so much in there. And if you are interested, of course, I'm happy to answer more questions on it. And one of the nicest things that came from publishing the paper and the press release that came out at the same time as it was that an academic who's also a poet got in touch with me, Sam Illingworth, and he said that the paper had actually inspired him to write a poem. So I thought I'd end this talk with reading out the poem that he wrote, which was called Diverse Bumbling. We map your presence across field and pasture, tracing flights of fancy from marsh and mire to gardens, hedges, lanes. Across freshwater edges, you weave your dance, vibrant stripes of fur drifting over bracken and herbs, with the casual impertinence of independent passage. Transects diverge, breaking transitions with dissecting lines of gold and black as you hurry down corridors made narrow in escape. Sorry, my voice breaking up at the end there. But thank you very much for listening, and yep, happy to answer any questions.
Thank you for a fantastic talk, Penelope.